Hello, I'd like to welcome you to our session today. This is the EASO New Investigator Award in Childhood Obesity session. I'm Jennifer Baker from Copenhagen, Denmark, and I'm one of the co-chairs of EASO's Childhood Obesity Task Force. It's also my pleasure to introduce you today to my co-chair, Jens Christian Holm, if you'd like to say a few words.
Certainly. I would like to say thank you for being here and thank you for all coming here. I'd like to say that these new talented award winners are really important in the future in order to pave the way for the future for obesity research. Thank you.
So please now enjoy the presentation by this year's award winner. On behalf of the Childhood Obesity Task Force for the European Association for the Study of Obesity, it's with great pleasure that I announce this year's winner of the EASO New Investigator Award for Obesity in Children Research. This year's winner is Dr. Karen Matvienko-Sakar from the University of Cork in Ireland. We're really impressed with the work that she's done and the great contribution she's made in the area of developing a core outcome set on infant feeding interventions to prevent obesity in children. So this year, the 2020 award, and in these slightly unusual circumstances, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm absolutely thrilled to be awarded such a prestigious award from EASO. So what I'm going to do now, I think, is I'm going to give a brief talk on the core outcome set work that you mentioned. So I'll just launch into that now. So the work that I'm going to speak about, which was highlighted by Jennifer, is in relation to developing a core outcome set for infant feeding to prevent childhood obesity. So the title of the topic of the project is Changing Parents' Infant Feeding Behaviours to Prevent Childhood Obesity, with a focus on identifying important outcome measures. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're all quite familiar with the prevalence of childhood obesity. Approximately 1 in 5 children currently live with obesity, and the particular area that I'm interested in with regard to childhood obesity is in relation to infant feeding. So I'm particularly interested in parental interactions and parental well-being and how this might impact on child obesity outcomes and child growth outcomes. So in particular with regard to infant feeding, what I'm interested in is this how, when, and what infants are fed. So how with regard to whether infants are breastfed or bottle fed, whether it's a responsive feeding environment, what kind of interactions take place. With regard to when, it's things like when solids are introduced or when children progress through various stages of solid introduction. And then also the what, so this actual dietary intake piece as well. And because infant feeding is a parental behavior, unsurprisingly, there's an increasing number of interventions that actually target this behavior. So how a parent feeds an infant is something modifiable. We can actually try and intervene to help to improve the parent to do this better or to maintain doing this well. And what I have found in work that I've conducted and what others have found also is that there are inconsistent effects for these interventions. So we're not quite sure how best to do it as of yet. And there are a number of potential reasons why there are inconsistent effects. But one potential reason relates to this heterogeneity in outcomes that are assessed across trials. So what we're finding is that across different interventions and across different trials, people are examining, measuring, and reporting different outcomes for infant feeding interventions. And this is problematic because it limits our synthesis of intervention effects and it limits examination of mechanisms of change. So basically what we have is a situation where it's very difficult to compare the outcomes of different interventions across these trials because everybody's measuring something different or a collection of different things. So we can't actually figure out what works best for who and in what circumstances. So one proposed approach to addressing this is the development and the use of core outcome sets, which are supported by the COMET initiative in the University of Liverpool. And a core outcome set is a standardized minimum set of outcomes that should be measured and reported in any trial for a specific health area. Importantly, they're not the only outcomes that should be measured and reported, but they are the minimum. So people can measure and report other outcomes as well, but it's recommended that these are the minimum that can be measured and reported. And they're useful because they can improve evidence syntheses, so we can start pulling the body of evidence and the body of literature together to better determine what works. They can help to reduce selective reporting bias, and they can increase stakeholder involvement. And as I talk through the project that I'm going to describe today, you'll see that stakeholders are highly involved in most of the stages of developing a core outcome set. And this is really important because it means that those outcomes that we end up examining in our obesity prevention efforts are those outcomes that are the most meaningful and the most important to those people for whom the intervention is meant to be used. So the specific project that I'm going to talk to you about is the development of a core outcome set for trials of infant feeding interventions to prevent childhood obesity. And this was published earlier on this year in the International Journal of Obesity, and it comprises a number of different kind of smaller studies which are also available. So the overall aim is to develop a core outcome set for use in randomized trials of infant feeding interventions to prevent childhood obesity. So as I said, it was comprised of a number of different studies or a number of different stages. So we had 4 stages in total, and I'm going to talk through each of these stages now. So the aim of the first stage was to synthesize all of the infant feeding outcomes that are available in the extant literature. So we wanted to compile what we were calling a long list of infant feeding outcomes. So we had to identify all of these. So to do so, we conducted a systematic review. So we examined a number of different databases. We included observational studies, quasi-experimental and trial designs. Our inclusion criteria were that the study examined at least one infant feeding outcome. And we didn't just limit this to one infant feeding outcome in the context of childhood obesity, as we were cognizant that potentially infant feeding outcomes that could be useful in this context might not yet have been reported in this context. And then we excluded studies that were looking at breastfeeding only because we were also interested in this complementary feeding period across the first year. We also excluded malnutrition, feeding related medical issues, and dental caries only studies. So we identified nearly 14,000 unique records. We screened nearly 600, and 126 articles were included in the final review. And what we did with these 126 articles was, with a multidisciplinary team, we extracted as many possible unique outcomes as we could. So we identified 82 unique infant feeding outcomes, which we grouped into 9 outcome domains, which you can see here. So we had breast and formula feeding as a kind of a category or a domain. We had practical feeding, the introduction of solids, the food environment, feeding practices and styles, parental perceptions of infant behavior and preferences, parents' knowledge and beliefs. We also had child weight outcomes and dietary intake. So what we had when we finished this evidence synthesis was this long list of 82 outcomes that we were then able to take to the next stage of the study. And this next stage was a small group meeting, the aim of which was to clarify identified outcomes from the previous stage and to also identify any additional outcomes. So we included national and international stakeholders. So we had a pediatrician, we had researchers, general practitioners or family doctors, public health nurses. So these are also called, I think, home visiting nurses and maternal child health nurses. We had dietitians and nutritionists. And I suppose the outcomes of this particular part of the study were that we got a clarity of outcome definitions through discussion and through a kind of a ranking of the different outcomes for how important people thought they were, whether or not they thought there were overlaps in the outcomes. And we also added in one fear of choking outcome also, which was recommended by the stakeholder group, but which had not been identified previously. So following this stage, we were quite confident that we had a very clear group of unique outcomes that could be brought forward to the next stage with very clear definitions that were accessible and understandable to our stakeholders. So the next stage was an electronic E-Delphi survey with the aim to prioritize the 83 identified outcomes from the previous stages. So again, we had national and international stakeholders. This time we had to collapse the grouping of the healthcare professionals. So we still included general practitioners, practice nurses, we had midwives, among other healthcare professionals. Then we had parents, researchers, and we also had childcare professionals as well. And our stakeholders engaged in a 3-round survey where outcomes were rated in each of the rounds from 1 to 5 following the grade recommendations. So in round 1, the participants were asked to rate all of the outcomes, and they could suggest up to 5 additional outcomes. In round 2, participants were shown their own ratings from round 1, And then they were shown the round one ratings for the other stakeholder groups. And the aim of this is to allow people to, I suppose, remember how they had rated outcomes, how important they thought they were previously, but then also to see how important other stakeholder groups thought these outcomes were, so that they can assess whether they want to maintain their previous outcome or whether they might want to change it based on the group. So then in round two, the participants re-rate all the outcomes. Then in round three, they're shown their own round two ratings again, their round two ratings for the other stakeholder groups, and then they engage in a final outcome rating. So this is how it worked in, I suppose, real time. So we had 253 participants in round one from 35 countries, 5 continents. These participants suggested an additional 11 outcomes. So we had 94 outcomes that were being brought forward to round two. In round two, we lost a few of the participants. We had 124 participants from 28 countries. The aim of this round was that we were hoping to group those outcomes that were rated as critical or for which we didn't really have a consensus, and we were going to bring those forward to round three. So any outcomes that people voted as not critical or not core for inclusion were going to be left out of round three, but all of the outcomes were rated as either critical or non-consensus, so they were all brought forward to round three. And in round three, we had 79 participants from 23 countries. And again, the aim here was to try and identify those outcomes that participants rated as critical and non-consensus, and to bring those outcomes forward. And as is sometimes the case with core outcome sets, our participants were very reluctant to rate any of the outcomes as not critical. So all of our outcomes, again, were critical or voted as kind of having no consensus. So they were all brought forward to the next stage of the study. And the next stage was the consensus meeting. So the consensus meeting's aim was to achieve consensus on the core outcome set with a panel of key stakeholders. So we had parents, general practitioners, nurses, dietitians, and researchers. And within this consensus meeting, all of the outcomes were discussed. They were rated from 1 to 9. Following this rating, they were grouped into being critical for inclusion, not critical for inclusion, or again, no consensus. These ratings were fed back to the group, and there was further discussion based on the ratings, and then we asked our stakeholders to engage in a final rating, so yes or no. And the core outcomes for the final core outcome set were those outcomes where 70% or more of participants voted yes. So in the final core outcome set, we had 26 outcomes that were voted as being core, and those outcomes sat within the same 9 outcome domains that I introduced previously. And they're as follows. So within the breast and formula feeding outcome domain, we have duration of breastfeeding for mother, duration of exclusive breastfeeding, the feeding method, the amount, the volume of the formula consumed, and the type of formula fed to infants if they're consuming formula. For introduction of solids, there was just the one outcome that was voted as core, and this was the infant's age when solids were first introduced. For parental knowledge and beliefs, again, it was just the one outcome, which was knowing what foods should be offered or avoided. For parental feeding practices and styles, there was pressuring the child to eat, parental modeling of eating behaviors, and also responsive infant feeding. Within practical feeding, this was whether the child self or was assisted with feeding. Within food environment, we had the feeding environment in which the infant feeding takes place, and then we also had whether or not the caregiver offers healthy foods within this environment. For child weight outcomes, we have child weight, but we also have weight gain over time, and we have body composition. For parents, perceptions of infant feeding behaviors and preferences, this was their perception of food preferences, but also of the infant's satiety responsiveness. And in the final grouping, which was the dietary intake, we have the types of food consumed, the portion size, whether infants were offered age-appropriate foods and beverages, whether the infants eat ready-made or homemade foods, and then types of other drinks consumed as well. So in conclusion, we developed a 26 core outcome set for infant feeding interventions to prevent childhood obesity. And while 26 might seem like quite a lot of outcomes to be included as a minimum, you can see from some of the outcomes that I've presented that quite a number of them can be included in a single kind of self-report measurement tool. We recommend that these 26 outcomes are the minimum to collect and report in future trials, and that doing so will improve synthesis and examination of intervention effects. So it will ultimately enable us to better compare the outcomes of the interventions that we're testing and that we're hoping to implement, so that we can actually work to improve child obesity outcomes and child health. And just to finish on some acknowledgements, I would like to very greatly thank the stakeholders in our stakeholder meeting, our E-Delphi and our consensus meeting, to acknowledge the excellent project team that I have behind me to conduct this work, and also to acknowledge the funders of this work, the Health Research Board, the Irish Research Council, and the Health Research Board Trial Methodology Research Network. So, and I would also like to thank ESO and ICO for the opportunity to present this work, and again just to say thank you very much for the award.
You're very welcome, and on behalf of EASO and the Childhood Obesity Task Force and myself, I'm Jennifer Baker, and my co-chair, Dr. Jens Christian Holm. Congratulations, and we look forward to seeing what you do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.